Since 1923, Roy O. Martin, a Louisiana-based wood products company, has followed the example of its founder to give back to our Louisiana communities where we live and work. To learn more, visit royomartin.com. The Louisiana Lottery is proud to join LPB in honoring the 2018 Louisiana Legends, contributing over $3.5 billion for K-12 public education. The lottery is giving Louisiana a reason to smile. Support for the 2018 Louisiana Legends comes from Willis Knighton, a locally owned, locally operated not-for-profit health system serving patients in the Arklatex since 1924.
Hello, welcome to Louisiana Legends. I'm Beth Courtney, and we're here with a 2018 Louisiana legend, Sybil Morial, in her lovely home. We're going to have a wonderful conversation with her, but first, let's take a look at this short biography. Sybil Idell Morial, educator, activist, and community leader, was born in New Orleans in the 1930s. Her father, C.C. Idell, was a surgeon, and her mother, Eudora, had been a teacher. Sybil had two brothers, Cece and Glenn, and one sister, Jean. Both she and her sister were debutantes, and the family was part of the New Orleans Creole elite. Yet as African Americans in the era of Jim Crow, they faced the humiliations of segregation.
Her parents always instilled in her that things were going to change. And I think she knew that. As a young child, she was very smart, she was progressive. She was a 16-year-old who graduated early from high school. She went to Xavier University for 2 years, and then she transferred to Boston University.
In college, she met Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King, and they made quite an impression on her. Although she's very cute about saying Martin had a car, and girls would go out with him because, you know, the rest of the time you'd have to take the subway. So it was nice to have a guy with a car. So you never know what will catch your eye.
While a candidate for a master's degree, Sybil became a first-grade teacher, the first African-American to teach in the Newton, Massachusetts school system. After completing her education at Boston University, Sybil returned to her hometown of New Orleans, continued her life as a teacher, and married Ernest Dutch Morial. Together, they began a remarkable journey of breaking down racial barriers and achieving many history-making firsts.
It was dangerous to try to change the law. It was dangerous to be the first at everything. Everybody talks about Dutch being the first, and he was. But when he was being the first, it meant Sybil was also being the first.
I always respect her because I don't know how people like Sybil Morial, Coretta King, Murray Evans, those kind of women, you know, they were married to men who were always moving, movers and shakers. That's not easy to live with that.
She is an African-American woman who has been successful in so many different venues and in so many different ways during a time period in which there were so many barriers to African-Americans, particularly legal barriers.
Her involvement in education and assuring voting rights for African Americans led Sybil to found the Louisiana League of Good Government, an interracial women's organization devoted to guaranteeing civil liberties for all citizens. And it wasn't long before Sybil became a leader in nearly every community organization in New Orleans.
I guess I could best describe her as an icon in terms of civic activities, civil rights, quality of life issues in this state and this city. If you wanted to have somebody in any one of those areas, she had a front row seat. She was involved.
After the death of her husband on Christmas Eve in 1989, Sybil was asked to run for mayor. She declined and continued to work on several causes and supported her son Mark, who became mayor and served for 2 terms.
New Orleans would have been a far different city had her husband not been mayor and her son not been mayor, but that she had not been right there with them, consoling them, encouraging them, inspiring them. And after she raised her family as well, as during her time, she got involved herself in organizations and all the quality of life issues.
Sybil Morial's new book, is called Witness to Change, From Jim Crow to Political Empowerment. In it, she tells her story of being on the front lines in some of the most tumultuous times in our history.
And of course, she was a witness to change. I mean, no kidding, huge change. It's so important to understand how far back we were and how far we have come. She saw incredible change and she made incredible change.
It is important to be able to look up to someone and see someone who has integrity and has been able to put their intelligence, their faith, their values to good use, not just for themselves and their family, but for the greater good, for the greater community.
I think her biggest joy is seeing others happy, as well as successful and empowered by her. And I think that gives her joy that she has helped empower another generation of women.
Today, the former First Lady of New Orleans remains active, serving on the boards of numerous worldwide civic organizations. Mother of 5, grandmother of 7, Sybil Morial enjoys time with her family and sitting under the trees on the banks of a lazy bayou that flows behind her home. Well, welcome back. Sybil, thank you so much for allowing us to come into your home.
I'm delighted to have you.
Well, I'm looking forward to talking to you, and I want to really begin by saying I loved your book, Witness to Change. I thought it was extraordinary. And why did you decide to write it?
In 2005, I retired from Xavier. I had been an administrator for 28 years in various positions as Associate Dean, Associate Vice President, and finally Vice President for External Affairs. I retired 2 months before Katrina. Here comes Katrina, and I evacuated to Baton Rouge, where my daughter Cherie lives, and ended up there for 8 years. As I was grieving, my house flooded, and as I was grieving my losses, I was so sad that I had lost photographs and memorabilia and so many reminders of our wonderful life with my children. And as I lay in bed at night, I thought about each event in detail, one at a time. And the next morning, I'd get up and get on a computer and write the story. I wanted to do that for my grandchildren. My children also, because they didn't know the early part of my life, the details. They knew when we lived a public life. They were very aware and very much a part of it.
I especially enjoyed reading when you were a young girl. I was struck by the fact that your parents were so loving and sort of nurtured and kept you in a bubble, and so you were somehow, you didn't have the ill effects of segregation that period of time. But was that tough writing about that, or did you feel a necessity to write about that early time?
I felt a necessity because it was one of the factors that guided my life, my aspirations, and in my adult life, I wanted to address that. Even though the laws had changed, the sentiments and the feelings of many people have not changed.
Tell us about like riding your bikes to trying to go, you couldn't go to what, City Park?
Yes, we were limited, that we couldn't go to any public places, not any. So one day, my sister Jean, who's a year older than me, my friend Andrew Young, and 3 other teens, we were riding our bikes along Esplanade Avenue, which you know is a beautiful street and has lovely homes. And when we got to the end of Esplanade, there was City Park, this beautiful, lush, green park. And we looked in and we wanted to go in, but we knew we weren't supposed to go in. But I guess we thought, nobody's gonna see us. And what harm are we doing? So we rode in and we had just pedaled a few yards when here comes a policeman who shook his billy club at us and said, "You get out. You little ends, no, you don't belong here." And of course we were crushed, even though we knew better. And we left. But the interesting thing is when we got out of the park and away from it, we said, we're not going to tell our parents because we know we didn't obey them. And we didn't tell them until years later, when of course society had changed, the laws had changed, and as I write, Jim Crow was on the run.
As a woman, you made your debut in New Orleans.
I did.
And so you had many opportunities, but you couldn't even shop in some of the shops.
That's right. They wouldn't let you try on clothes. And some of the salespeople would say, well, buy it, take it home, and if it's not right, bring it back. And I remember when I was going off to college, to Boston University, my mother took me to shop, and it was always with her selected salespersons. And she was not in that day. And she said, I'm gonna let you try it on, but she put me in a janitor's closet. And my mother walked out and said, never mind, we don't want them.
You went to college, first at Xavier, but then you decided to go up north.
I did.
And tell us about that train ride up to Boston.
My dad brought me to the train station. We went in the colored entrance. And then when the train was called, we went out to get on the train. Now, I knew it was going to be segregated. I mean, my parents had told me that we would be in a special car. We were put in the baggage car. It was a car that was divided, half baggage and half passengers. And as we went up the platform, the porter called and said, come here, come in this door, to keep us from going further down and being further humiliated. He said, when you get up to the top, to the landing, turn right. That's the car you'll be in. And this was half a car. And I knew it was, well, I didn't know then, but I sat down, and when the car filled, we were all black. And so I said, well, here we are, where other people think we belong. But more than that, more than being segregated, when the conductor came to get our tickets, I asked him about dinner. And my parents told me that I could eat in the dining room. That was a new law in
17 at the
17.
17.
In 1948, travel interstate, between states, segregated travel on the trains was prohibited. So we could go to the dining room. But that was an experience, walking through several cars to the dining room. When I got there, they escorted me to this table. And after I was seated, they pulled a curtain around me. That table was for Negroes. I guess so white people didn't have to look at us.
When you arrive in Boston and you're at the university there, you discover you can go to all sorts of things in the city because you like opera and you love museums, right?
Yes. See, I knew that because we traveled a lot with my father. My father would go to the National Medical Association meeting. He'd put us all in the car, and we'd go. Sometimes we'd go on the train. So I knew what the North was. It was free. You could go to restaurants. You could go to museums. So I was looking forward to that in Boston. And I participated in everything I wanted to. I saw my first theater musical, Oklahoma. I'll never forget. It was wonderful. Oh. I could go to the movies. I could go to the museums and without any fear of being rejected or humiliated. So I loved Boston.
Your book, Witness to Change, talks about your journey, if you will, not only from New Orleans and all around the world and broadening your experiences, but you, of course, are personal friends with some of the leaders of the civil rights movements that went on. Of course, are you related to Andrew Young, or are you just best friends?
Best friends, because our mothers were friendly. And as I say in my book, because we were deprived of going to public places, they made events happen. We had family picnics, and we had Easter egg hunts on Dillard's campus. And they saw that we went to Dillard and Xavier to hear Paul Robeson and to hear Ann Miller and to hear nationally recognized African Americans.
Well, you also came to know Martin Luther King there.
Yes. Martin Luther King was in graduate school at Boston University when I was in undergraduate school. Now, many of the black students in all of the area schools knew each other through fraternities and sororities and through family networks. We had so many things in common. So we all knew each other. And we talked about the South and talked about the freedom of the North, but talked about the South had to change. Even that was 1950, so that's when the civil rights cases were before the courts and before the Supreme Court. And so when the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka was declared, was the court case, and the Supreme Court rendered the decision, unanimous decision, that was a thrill, that it was unanimous, that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. We all, those of us from the South, from Jacksonville, from Atlanta, where Martin was from Richmond, and from Memphis, all of the time, we wanted to go back home because we wanted to be a part of change. We knew change was coming.
Right.
We had no idea what it would be, but we wanted to be that, and we all came back. Martin was the big first. He said, I'm going back. I'm going back to head a church in Alabama.
During this period of time, of course, you met your future husband.
Had to come back home now.
Oh, that's right. You came back home. Well, that's one of the pluses of coming home then.
It was.
Yeah, when did you and Dutch first meet?
We knew each other peripherally in high school and college, but when I came home, I called my friend Lydia and I said, what's up? What's on the social scene? She said, well, our Great Books Club is meeting at my home tonight, so come. We established our own Great Books Club because we were rejected at the New Orleans Public Library. So we did our own, but the best thing about it is we could select our own books. So we would meet, talk about the book, and then we'd socialize after. So that very night, W.E.B. Du Bois's book, Souls of Black Folk, you know, he was a leader back in the teens and the 20s and 30s. That's what we discussed, and there was Dutch, and I said hi. But everybody had left, and he lingered, and I lingered, and so we were walking out together. And we were talking about Brown. We weren't talking about W.E.B. Du Bois's book. And so we got so animated discussing that. He said, well, let's talk some more about it. So he took me to a nightclub, and we talked until we were just so full and excited about it. And he said, this conversation is not over, continued tomorrow. So our relationship, we saw each other every night after that.
After that,
that's all we talked about.
Well, we know a lot about your husband's career. He was the first African-American graduate from LSU Law School, I think.
Yes.
And then he was always the first wherever he was, at the legislature.
And
was there a lot of pressure? Yeah. And as a judge?
Yes, there was pressure because we were getting reactions from the community. We were getting hate calls, and we were getting threats. And so it was difficult because I had young children. When we got the phone threats, which were very constant during the time he was running for the legislature and the time he was in the legislature, at that time there was a communist threat. There was still a communist threat, and so that was the buzzword. You know, they called him an communist. And so I had to protect my children because they would run to answer the telephone. I said, you don't need to answer the telephone because this voice would come out raspy, not only making racial slurs, but also horrible language, you know, just unacceptable language.
You helped in the campaigning for mayor and everything. Well, what was your role in the campaign?
Well, I tell you what, before that, I founded an organization that was interested in voter education, which consisted of voter registration, which was really a long and humiliating process, could have been. But we needed to educate ourselves about all the aspects of government so we could educate the public we were dealing with. But the big thing we did is we had 4 units in the city, one at Gus Holmes, which was the first senior citizens housing for blacks in the city, but we went to black churches. And we would go through the registration process, which was a citizenship test, a literacy test, teaching them to be confident because they were all braced to be humiliated. You know, that's something that gets to be instinctive. And so we did that in 4 areas in the city. So I knew how to deal with the people, and I knew many of the people. And so when Dutch ran for the state legislature, I established phone banks where we called people to ask them if they were registered voters, if they were interested, and they could come to one of our workshops. And then a couple of days before election, we'd call them. On election day, we'd call, did you vote today?
So Sybil, I have to ask you, have you ever regretted not running for office yourself?
No, I didn't. I liked what I was doing. I was an educator. I was a classroom teacher for, I guess, 13 years in Massachusetts and Maryland and Louisiana. And then I was at the university, Xavier University, for 28 years. And I loved what I was doing. I loved working with the young people. So no, I never aspired to that. But I could be in the background doing things that would promote public participation.
Looking back across all of that, you've done research on your early history that I found fascinating. Your roots, you always thought they were French in some ways.
And African.
And African, and from Senegal, perhaps. But you discovered interesting things, didn't you?
Yes. We had a family reunion, a Hydel family reunion, which is my father's name. When I was writing the book, this research was being done for Whitney Plantation. It was a plantation on the German coast. Many Germans had settled there. And that is where my great-grandfather was born. One great. Wow. The father of my grandfather, which is not that much, not so long in the past. And he was the son of a house servant and the brother of the mistress of the plantation, Victor. We had heard, my elder cousins, a tradition in our family was to go to the graveyard in Edgard, which is where my grandparents and uncles, grand uncles and all that are buried. It's like on New Year's Day, it was a picnic. And we brought food because we sat there, but it was kind of a reunion with all the cousins, you know, and we played around in the graveyard. And we would hear the elder cousins talking about Victor and Celeste, and we'd hear these names, but they never said slave. That name, that word never came out. And as I reflect on it, it was either, or it was both, shame and pain. After slavery was declared unconstitutional, Reconstruction came and they established schools for the ex-slaves and free people of color. Before that, slaves were not allowed to learn to read, but the schools only went up to 5th grade. So my father was the oldest of 9 children of one of those sons of a slave, former slave. And so his father had to send him to New Orleans to finish his education, to finish elementary school and high school, and even college, have a straight college. And he went to medical school, but he couldn't go to LSU or Tulane. And black people didn't go to the same schools as white people. He had to travel all the way to Washington, D.C.
To Howard?
To Howard University,
Right.
yes. And the strange thing is, a generation later, when my brother was going to medical school, which was before or during the Civil Rights era, the state paid him a stipend for his medical education. I guess it was sort of an apology, a makeup, because then people's consciousness was being raised about how unfair this was.
So when you look back over this history, as we're witness to change, and you see through the lens of maturity, I suppose, what do you think your grandchildren are thinking? What do you think they will think about this period of time? Have you asked them?
I'm not sure. I gave each one of them a book. They have read it, but I want them to read. I want them to read parts of it and ask me questions. Now, my children were very much a part of it, and it sort of directed their careers in their different careers. They are performing services. They are aware of inequities during their time, and they are a part of that change. And I'm so pleased with that. And it was their own choices.
Certainly, your Catholic faith has helped you through this too. And do you think that's one of the things holding on to through these generations?
I think so, and I think particularly my children's generation, they saw that the black church was a stronghold of change, and that in these churches they were encouraged to be strong and to be brave, and this is temporary, this is a hard time, but we're going to reach, as Martin King said, the promised land. Now, it would not be in Eden, but we knew there would be change. So in those churches, you were nourished with that concept, you know. And you didn't get that in a Catholic church because it's very ritual oriented. Mm-hmm. So they learned, because my children went to the churches with my husband when he was campaigning, and even after he became mayor, they were familiar with all. They just tag along. They were in his life more than he was in their life, because he was busy all the time, and I worried about that. But he was a strong father. He was a strong mentor. He was a strong model for them.
Well, Sybil, you are certainly a strong model for all of us, a teacher, an authoress, and another book coming out. And we congratulate you on being a Louisiana Legend. And thank you so much for visiting with us. We appreciate it.
I've enjoyed it so much, and I'm truly honored by being named a Louisiana Legend.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us. Good evening.
Since 1923, Roy O. Martin, a Louisiana-based wood products company, has followed the example of its founder to give back to our Louisiana communities where we live and work. To learn more, visit royomartin.com. The Louisiana Lottery is proud to join LPB in honoring the 2018 Louisiana Legends, contributing over $3.5 billion for K-12 public education. The lottery is giving Louisiana a reason to smile. Support for the 2018 Louisiana Legends comes from Willis Knighton, a locally owned, locally operated not-for-profit health system serving patients in the Arklatex since 1924.
For a copy of this program, call 1-800-973-7246 or go online to www.lpb.org.